All right, look, we all say some really dumb things from time to time. Even I say some dumb things, and trust me, you guys have no problem reminding me when I say something dumb in the comments. But today I wanted to take a not-so-toddler approach of fighting with you back and forth about it on my comments and instead cover 5 generic dumb things that I hear every day on my comments. And it's not personal, that's why I'm not calling you out, Bob or Susie or whoever it is. This is a generic 5 dumb things I hear on my channel. And I think you do well to pay attention to these, just to consider for a moment, not saying these 5 dumb things. Now, to be fair, there's a lot of misinformation out there. In a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week news cycle, it is important for the media to get out to the story as quickly as possible and not be scooped by all the other stations. And when that happens, mistakes are going to get put out there early on. Unfortunately, once those mistakes are out there in the public, it is almost impossible to get that narrative to go away. The same misinformation keeps getting repeated over and over and over again. For example, when I recently made a video in which I pointed out how Bryan Kohberger allegedly returned to the crime scene the next morning, a lot of people were saying, devil's advocates, don't you realize they've got pictures of Bryan Kohberger at his bank that morning? They know that he wasn't at the house. And yet, we will continue to hear people saying, devil's advocates, Bryan Kohberger not only was there that night, and they got video of it all over the place, but he went back the next morning to the crime scene. And I'm like, okay, so this has been out there for a long time now about the bank video footage of Bryan Kohberger being there, and yet we're still hearing the same quote-unquote dumb thing repeated. So let's talk about some of those dumb things that we repeat over and over again. Here's a list of some of the 5 things I think are kind of like we need to kind of correct these things. One, for example, is Bryan Kohberger's DNA is all over that crime scene. That, again, is way overstated. It is okay for you to say, well, it's okay for you to say whatever the hell you want, but I would recommend you not say these dumb things, that Bryan Kohberger's DNA is all over that crime scene. As you probably know, you should know by now, that DNA is an invisible-sized piece of DNA. It's not even something you can see with the naked eye. And it's one speck in a crime scene that includes 4 murders over the course of 2 floors. So the bigger mystery is how more of that DNA is not in the house. It's just a tiny speck of DNA. There are cases in which transfer DNA from one crime scene to another happened because people who responded to the crime scene brought in DNA from another crime scene. That kind of stuff happens all the time. And let's not forget, by the way, and this is the part that why I say it's a dumb or ignorant comment to keep bringing up how strong you think the DNA evidence is. The prosecution and the feds have not, to this day, disclosed entirely to the defense how it is they developed that DNA profile. That should be a constitutional violation. The defense needs to be able to see how they developed the profile and be able to challenge that evidence. That's our constitutional right. So far, the judges allowed them to continue to hide how they developed the profile. Earlier on, when Othram Labs was developing that profile, they brought it to 4 different brothers, none of which had the name Kohberger, and yet somehow when the FBI took over, they developed a hit on Bryan Kohberger, and then told Moscow Police Department, hey, the person you should be looking at is Bryan Kohberger, which they called a tip. That whole DNA sequence and how they developed the DNA is hotly contested and has been for 2 years, and yet, because it was out in the media that his DNA was found at the scene, it keeps being repeated over and over again. This is an open and shut case. DNA is DNA every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Thank you, Hitler. That was still a great comment. The point being is that the DNA evidence is being contested, is being fought over, and as you probably know, the defense is stating that there are other reasons how Bryan Kohberger's DNA could get at the scene. Now, at the end of the day, it may be Bryan Kohberger's DNA or it may not be his DNA, but how they developed it is still being hidden. So until we see how they developed that profile, which the defense has a really good case to say there was some sketchy shit that they basically tried to hammer a square peg into a round hole, we don't know. So I would just hold back a little bit on saying the dumb things that Bryan Kohberger's DNA is all over the crime scene. It's not even close. Another one that keeps getting repeated over and over again is Bryan Kohberger's car, devil's advocates, was seen circling the house over and over again. No, again, this is misleading information that should have been corrected a long time ago. You should all know better than anyone that car, known as Suspect Vehicle 1, has no legible license plate that you can see. In other words, let me rephrase that. It's not even clear that it doesn't have a license plate. So for those of you out there who say, oh, the PCA stated that we noted that the car had no front license plate, you can't see that. They even admitted that under oath later on, that yes, in fact, they couldn't see whether the car had a front license plate or not. They only wrote that into the PCA because they later found out Bryan Kohberger had a white Elantra that had no front license plate, and so they wrote it in to the PCA that they observed it with no front license plate. So many people are not paying attention to the details because as the misinformation gets corrected over time, people still continue to repeat the early first information. They saw Bryan Kohberger in his car driving around that scene with no license plate on the front of the car. None of that is true. It's been dispelled for a long, long time. It is suspect vehicle 1. And in fact, the defense has pointed out numerous times that there is no continual footage of so-called suspect vehicle 1. And so therefore, it is for the jury to decide if the little snippet you have here, and then the little snippet you have here, and then the little snippet you have here are all the same vehicle or not. Because you labeling it suspect vehicle 1 is seen here, and suspect vehicle 1 is seen here, and suspect vehicle 1 is seen here, prejudices the jury. The jury has to decide whether they think that's the same vehicle. You telling them this is the same vehicle is prejudicial. And again, I don't care if you think Bryan Kohberger is guilty or not. That's not the point. The suspect vehicle 1 is hotly debated and has been argued for a long time. And the cell phone data information, that's crazy as well. We know that, for example, now you should know the terminology pinged the cell phone tower that services the house at 1122 King Road is a hell of a lot different than Bryan Kohberger's car was sitting outside the house. Hitting the cell phone tower that services, like, do critical listening skills. These things are easy to dismiss. And so what's out there in the narrative all the time is Bryan Kohberger was circling the house hours, many times before the killings. That has been dispelled for a long time. And yet in my comments, every single day, someone has to remind me that Bryan Kohberger was circling the house that night. You don't know that. The defense has made a great argument. They brought in an expert who has put people away on cell phone data over and over again. It always worked for the prosecution. And for the first time in his life, he's coming forward for the defense saying, this is manipulated data and you know it. And we're still going to fight that in court. But you guys will continue to say it's a done deal. Bryan Kohberger's car is circling the house over and over again. One of the dumbest things I really can't stand is this narrative that has been put out in the media with absolutely no founding, in my opinion, which is the whole Bryan Kohberger is an incel. He just can't get laid and therefore he hates women and must kill them because he's angry that he can't have pretty women. Multiple documentaries, including a book by Howard Bloom, has talked about how Bryan Kohberger hit on pretty women at a pool party and got their phone numbers. Bryan Kohberger had no problem with a coworker who is a female having romantic feelings towards him and even calling him when someone broke into her house and stayed the night at his apartment, as one of the documentaries stated. This all stems, this whole incel idea stems from the idea that Bryan Kohberger was being reprimanded at his university because as a teaching assistant, he graded some females' papers more harshly than males, which led to then he must be a misogynist and he must hate women. And therefore, because he hates women and he's really bad with women, which had no basis whatsoever, no evidence has come out showing Bryan Kohberger is bad with women, but it keeps getting repeated over and over again. He's an incel, involuntary celibate. The guy can't get women, and so therefore he hates women and he just wants to kill them because they're pretty and he can't have it. Well, that flies in the face of documentaries which show good-looking guys saying, man, Bryan Kohberger's a player. He scooped me to that girl's phone number. Multiple women gave him their phone number. Even one woman who came on TV and said, I'm not sure why I didn't call Bryan Kohberger back, but thank God I didn't. No, it wasn't he was really creepy and I was never going to call that guy. I just did him a lip service by giving him my phone number. It's no, I gave him his phone number and I'm not sure why I didn't call him back. So this repeated crap about Bryan Kohberger's an incel who hates women because he graded some female papers harshly is ignorant. And the idea that he was stalking Maddie Mogan because on Instagram, an account which, by the way, has repeatedly been said we're not sure was Bryan Kohberger's account and has now been deleted. But even though Dateline even put on their TV saying we're not sure this is Bryan Kohberger's Instagram account, we can't confirm he actually owned it, they'll still show you screenshots of Bryan Kohberger's profile on Instagram, which doesn't exist anymore, and then him thumb-upping a picture of Maddie Mogan to plant the story that he wanted her so badly because he liked her photo that he had to kill her because she rebuffed him, with no evidence whatsoever that he'd ever met Maddie Mogan, that she'd ever rebuffed him. But we're going to keep repeating that same dumb thing over and over. He's an incel and he hates pretty girls and he must kill them because he can't have them. Stupid. Another one of my dumbest thing, in my opinion, that I hear all the time, and again, nothing personal, I'm not calling out Bob, Susie, Heather, or whoever the case may be, those are random names, not actual people, is the idea that Bryan Kohberger, did you hear that Bryan Kohberger was obsessed with serial killers? He was obsessed with Ted Bundy, and he was obsessed with BTK, and he even wrote a Reddit post where he was asking killers what they were thinking and how they picked their victims and how they felt doing the killings. Oh my God, guilty as fuck. Okay, so Did we not forget somehow that it has been proven over and over again that Bryan Kohberger was a criminology student, and he was one of only 2 candidates recommended to the PhD program from DeSales University, that his professor felt that he was one of the brightest minds that they had seen, and recommended Bryan Kohberger, only 2 people that they've ever recommended in their life, to the PhD candidacy. He was working on and telling his family, Bryan Kohberger, that he wanted to understand criminals, and he was going to be a master criminologist. He was going to help catch bad guys. Did you realize that in order to catch bad guys, you kind of have to understand how bad guys think? And did you realize that this so-called Reddit thing that you're all freaking out about, the survey where he asked killers how they picked their victims, is literally out of the handbook of how to understand and profile killers? You know, you need to understand, according to the manuals on how to profile killers, how does a killer think? How do they pick their victims? How do they feel? What emotions were going through their head? That's how you understand the mind of a killer. So Bryan Kohberger doing that is literally coursework. Like, literally his coursework. And so you're basically, by this logic of saying, because he put that Reddit survey out there, that he's guilty, saying that anybody who goes into the field of criminology is probably a budding serial killer. Because if they ever look into why criminals commit crimes, that makes them suspicious and they're a serial killer. And how about that whole studying Ted Bundy and BTK? Again, what criminologist would be doing any bit of a service to their field if they didn't watch the masters, if you will, the ones that are big names, the Gacy's, the Bundys, the BTK? Of course they have to study those individuals. By the way, I have studied those individuals from time to time, and I'm not a serial killer. I'm not in criminology. America has fascination with serial killers. That's why we have so many specials about serial killers. That's why look at how many different specials there are about Ted Bundy over the years, or the Zodiac Killer, or any of these guys. There's a million. Why? Because America is fascinated by serial killers. But again, pounding that square peg into a round hole, Bryan Kohberger must be guilty because he looked up people like Ted Bundy. Oh my God, it's literally his coursework. And lastly, of course, the one that everybody hates hearing about is Dylan Mortonson literally puts Bryan Kohberger at the scene. She saw the killer eye to eye, saw his height, his build, his bushy eyebrows. She literally puts Bryan Kohberger at the scene. Again, this is the most asinine, dumbest thing I've heard. Literally, when Dylan Mortonson was shown a picture of Bryan Kohberger and asked about it, she didn't recognize him as the person she saw that night. She also said on one of her many accounts of that night that she's not sure it even happened. She may have dreamt the entire thing. She was also too hammered. She was drunk, really drunk, she said, and she's not sure she remembers it correctly or if it even happened. Then she'll argue about whether or not she saw Xana behind a closed, or whether the door was closed and she didn't see Xana on the floor, or whether the door was open and she saw Xana laying on the floor and assumed she passed out. That story that Dylan Mortonson has told, and the missing 8 hours of time before she decided to call, or anyone decided to call 911, and all of the mystery surrounding that is a mystery for a reason. So this repeated attempt by people in my comments to come on and call me, Mr. Ibrigitz, you're an idiot. Dylan Mortonson literally puts him in the house. Dylan Mortonson has zero credibility. You should know that by now. If you don't know, then you shouldn't be watching this case, because you're really missing something. And again, I don't care. At the end of the day, I don't have a dog in this fight. If you believe Bryan Kohberger is guilty, I don't have a problem with you telling me I think he's guilty and here's the reasons why. But when you say things and you attack me personally and say, Devil's Advocates, you're a moron. Don't you know Bryan Kohberger's DNA is all over the house? They've got him literally on camera going around the house over and over again. He returns the next morning after the killings. They got his cell phone tower pinging, and Dylan Mortonson literally puts him in the house. Don't you know all these things? Don't you know that those have been dispelled and been fought over for years? It's some of the dumbest things you can say. So again, I would ask, and I know I'm not going to get that, but I just thought it would be worth making the video today. I would ask for people to just be a little bit more careful with your wording. Rather than saying, we know Bryan Kohberger's DNA is there, say, the prosecution has stated that Bryan Kohberger's DNA is there. The defense apparently is arguing it. Much better, much more factual. Or how about, the prosecution says that Bryan Kohberger was circling the house. The the defense has brought in an expert saying that they're not sure Bryan Kohberger was even there. In fact, he was somewhere completely opposite, and they can prove it. So we're not sure. That would be great. Now, I realize that guilters are never going to give Bryan Kohberger the benefit of the doubt. They're going to use every documentary and everything that's been out there and all the misleading shit that's been said from day one and just keep repeating it over and over and over. Devil's Advocates, you're an idiot. Bryan Kohberger's at the scene, literally placed at the scene with him and his cell phone and freaking a picture of him smiling after the murders, because that's exactly what happened. You're an idiot. Well, at the end of the day, you may be right. You may be right. Bryan Kohberger may be guilty. But I'm not going to repeat some of the dumb shit out there, because I realize that there's a court system in this country for a reason, and a person is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And we have watched people be wrongfully convicted because their DNA was at a crime scene they were never at, because somebody else transferred it to the scene. That kind of shit happens all the time. If you're in America, like some of the people, one of my favorite comments, I'll close on this, and my thing is, of course we know Bryan Kohberger is guilty. He's arrested. If somebody else did it, they would have arrested somebody else. That is one of the dumbest, most ignorant, and that should be number 6. That's the bonus one. Dumbest thing I've ever heard. We know he's guilty because he's been arrested. If it was somebody else, they would have arrested them. So in your mind, people who act like this, in America, if you've been arrested, you're already guilty. Well, let's not even have any court system anymore. Just convict them.